My name's Emma Jack, and I have a son named Liam who's 20 and away at college right now. We've been saving money for years to support him through college, cutting corners and skipping vacations so he could have a chance at something bigger. We live in the house my grandmother left us when she moved into a nursing home. It's big and comfy, but nothing fancy. It just feels like home. Jack works at the local hardware store, and I manage the front desk at a doctor's office. We live a simple life without extra luxuries, and we're okay with that. One Thursday afternoon, the sun was setting just right, making us think about ending the day early. But then Jack's phone rang, interrupting any thoughts of an early weekend. I was chopping carrots for dinner and making a list of bills when I heard him answer. "Hello, Mom. Slow down. What's wrong?" His face turned pale as he listened. I stopped what I was doing, watching him pace. He ended the call looking shaken. "That was my dad," he said, sinking into the couch like a puppet with its strings cut. "Their business tanked, bankrupt. They've lost everything, even the house." My heart sank. "Oh, Jack, that's terrible. What are they planning to do?" "They want to come stay with us for a bit," he replied, "till they sort something out." I hesitated, thinking about our tight budget and the order of our life that was about to be disrupted. "And what did you tell them?" He rubbed his neck, a sign he was stressed. "Told them I'd talk to you first. It's your house, Emma. Wouldn't just spring that on you without checking." Jack's parents, Frank and Helen, weren't the easygoing type. They were used to the good life, unlike our simple setup. "You know how they are, Jack. This house isn't their style." I know," he said uneasily. "But they're my folks, Em. They're stuck thinking of all the times they visited, noses turned up at our modest living. It's clear they'd be like fish out of water here." But then, imagining them desperate enough to ask for help, my resolve softened. "All right, they can come, but it's temporary, right? Just until they're back on their feet," I said. Jack picked up his phone, dialed, and after a brief, muffled exchange, he said, "Mom, Emma and I talked it over. You can crash here for a bit, but just until you find a place. Got it? We're not running a hotel." I couldn't hear the response on the other end, but Jack's tight-lipped "Yes, Mom, we're clear" gave me the gist. He hung up and exhaled long and hard. "They're thankful, Em. They'll be here next week," Jack told me. Last week, Jack had told his folks they could stay with us for a bit, and today they were moving in. I watched from the porch as two huge trucks rolled up our driveway, and I swear my heart sank. Jack was out there directing traffic like a parking lot attendant, trying to keep a smile plastered on his face. Frank was the first to barrel out of the car, a big grin on his face, clapping Jack on the back so hard you'd think he'd won the lottery instead of just moving into his son's house. Helen swept up to me, all perfumed and peppy, planting a kiss on my cheek that felt more like a branding iron. "You're an angel for letting us invade like this." I forced a smile, my eyes darting to the mountain of stuff they were unloading. "It's no problem, Helen. But is this all of it?" "Oh, this is just the essentials." She waved a dismissive hand, as if the pile of furniture and boxes wasn't already swallowing our front yard. "The rest we'll put in storage." Essentials. I bit my tongue to keep from saying anything rash. If these were essentials, I dreaded to think what they'd left behind. Jack caught my eye, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. "Let's get this stuff inside," Jack said, more to himself than anyone else. Frank and Helen directed the movers with the kind of authority you'd think they were moving into a palace, not our modest little home. The movers shuffled past, hauling armchairs, countless boxes, and would you believe it, a grandfather clock. Who needs a grandfather clock in their temporary home? I muttered under my breath, but Frank directed, pointing at various spots around our living room, which was rapidly disappearing under a sea of their belongings. I pulled Jack aside while the movers took a breather. "Jack, this is crazy. They brought enough to furnish a whole house. Where are we going to put all this?" I whispered urgently. Jack rubbed his temples. I know. I'll talk to them, okay? Let's just get through today." We retreated as the movers continued their work. The whole ground floor was turning into a replica of Frank and Helen's old house. Every corner filled, every space taken over. By the time the movers were done, our once cozy living room looked more like a storage unit. Dinner that night was a chaotic affair. We barely found the table under all the clutter. Frank and Helen seemed oblivious to the mess, chatting away about their journey here. Emma, you really should try this wine, Frank said, popping open a bottle of something French and probably more expensive than our entire grocery budget for the week. We're so grateful to you both. Helen chimed in, her voice sugary enough to give you cavities. It's just until we find our feet. Yeah, about that, Jack started, clearing his throat. We need to talk about some ground rules. Space is tight. Oh, don't worry about it, son, Frank waved him off. We'll manage just fine, won't we, dear? He smiled at Helen, who nodded enthusiastically. I looked around at our invaded space, the piles of boxes, the fancy ornaments crowding out our simple decorations. Managed just fine? I wasn't so sure about that. A few days passed since they moved in, and just when I thought we'd settled into some kind of routine, the kitchen became the new battleground. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was fixing dinner as usual, something simple and hearty, spaghetti with homemade tomato sauce. I was stirring the pot when Helen walked into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling as if she'd just walked into a barn. What's that smell? She asked, her tone dripping with disdain. It's dinner, I replied, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. Spaghetti night. Spaghetti? She scoffed, peering over my shoulder. Where's the meat, the fresh herbs? This is what you feed us. Jack, hearing the commotion, wandered in, drying his hands on a dish towel. What's the problem? His mom turned to him with a look that could curdle milk. The problem, Jack, is that we're expected to eat this. She gestured at the bubbling pot as if it were a cauldron of poison. I took a deep breath, trying not to let her get to me. It's what we usually eat. We can't afford steaks and fancy meals every night. Jack stepped between us, his face set in hard lines. Mom, this is Emma's house, and this is what we eat. If you want something else, you're welcome to cook for yourselves. Oh, we will, Helen retorted, her eyes narrowing. And we expect you to provide the groceries we require. We're not used to living like this. I'd had enough. Look, I'm sorry you're used to different. But this is what we can manage. Our budget doesn't stretch to luxuries, I insisted. Frank, who'd been silent up till then, chimed in, his voice booming. Then perhaps you need to re-evaluate your budget, young lady. We're not animals to feed on scraps. Jack's jaw clenched. Dad, that's enough. We're doing the best we can. The room was thick with tension, everyone's shoulders up around their ears. Finally, Helen huffed. Fine, tomorrow we'll give you a list of what we eat. You can make sure it's here. True to her word, Helen handed me a list. Marbled beef, fresh seafood, organic this, imported that. I looked at the list, my heart sinking. That evening, we sat down with Frank and Helen, the list between us on the kitchen table. We expect proper meals, steaks from marbled beef or the finest fish, Frank declared, as if it was the most normal request in the world. Jack and I exchanged shocked looks. We can't swing that, he said, his voice firm but weary. That's just not in our budget. Their response was swift and harsh. Lazy, both of you, Helen snapped. Can't even provide a decent meal. In the end, feeling cornered, I caved to their demands. I started buying only the highest quality products for them, while Jack and I got by on fast food just to save costs. A month later, I sat down to crunch the numbers, and my heart nearly stopped. Our food expenses had doubled, and to top it off, Helen's daily luxurious baths had sent our water bill through the roof. Dinner had become a battlefield, but tonight was different. Frank and Helen were digging into some lavish dishes they'd insisted on buying, marbled steaks and imported fish. Meanwhile, Jack and I sat across from them, our plates filled with the simple pasta we could afford. The disparity wasn't just on our plates, it was drawing a deeper line between us every day. As they savored another bite of their expensive meals, I couldn't hold back any longer. This has got to stop, I said, the words heavy in the air. Helen looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth. What are you talking about now? We can't keep living like this, eating separately, different meals. It's ridiculous. From now on, everyone in this house eats the same, and we're sticking to what we can afford. Frank laughed, a harsh sound that grated on my nerves. You expect us to eat that slop. It's not slop, it's dinner. It's what we eat. I shot back, my patience fraying. The laughter vanished from Frank's face, replaced by a scowl. Helen chimed in, her tone sharp and accusing. How can you be so greedy and lazy? Cooking decent food isn't that hard. They both turned to Jack, their expressions full of expectation. "You're going to let her talk to us like this in your own house?" That was the last straw. Jack's hand slammed down on the table, making the plates jump. "First off, this is Emma's house, and you will treat her with respect." The impact of his words hit hard. Helen's eyes filled with tears, her voice quivering. "I never expected you to raise your voice at me, your own mother." Frank's anger boiled over as he stood, pointing an accusing finger at Jack. "Look at you, henpecked and dancing to her tune. Is this what you've become?" I stood my ground, though my heart was pounding. "Enough. This conversation is over. From today, no more expensive steaks or fish. We eat the same, all of us." Their looks could have frozen the room for a moment. No one moved. Then, without a word, Frank and Helen pushed back from the table and left. Jack and I sat back down, the silence hanging heavy between us. He reached for my hand, squeezing it tight. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," he said. "I am too," I replied, feeling the weight of the evening settle around us. "But it's the right thing. We can't live like this." After the big blow-up at dinner, things cooled down, but only on the surface. Frank and Helen were quieter, sure, but there was a tenseness to their silence that put me on edge. I had a feeling they weren't going to take the new house rules lying down, and I was right. It started subtly. A few days later, I was cleaning up after lunch of sandwiches when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a towel and headed to the front door, expecting maybe a package or a neighbor. But when I opened it, there stood a delivery guy holding a large aromatic bag from some high-end restaurant in town. "Delivery for Emma," he said, glancing at his clipboard. I was puzzled. There must be some mistake. I didn't order this. Just then, Helen appeared behind me, her smile a bit too wide. "Oh, I took the liberty of ordering for us. I thought we deserved a nice meal after all the recent discomfort." I frowned, taking the bag hesitantly. "Helen, we talked about this. We're cutting back on expenses." She shrugged, her eyes avoiding mine. "I thought it was on your tab, dear. My mistake." Jack walked in from the kitchen, overhearing us. "What's going on?" "Your mother decided we deserved an expensive lunch," I said, the weight of the bag in my hand suddenly feeling heavier. Jack's expression hardened. "Mom, we agreed no more of this." Frank stepped into the hallway, his voice booming. "What's a little lunch going to hurt? You can't expect us to live like monks forever." I set the bag down on the entranceway table, feeling the frustration bubble up. "It's not just lunch. It's every meal, every extra expense. We can't afford this. We told you we're sticking to a budget." Helen's face turned cold. "Well, if you're going to make such a fuss over a simple meal, I suppose we won't bother next time." Jack pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's not just about the meal. It's about respecting the rules of the house. You can't keep going behind our backs." The conversation went in circles for a few more minutes until Frank and Helen retreated to their room, leaving the uneaten expensive lunch on the table. Jack and I looked at each other, the unspoken agreement hanging between us that this couldn't go on. "I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders made without our consent," I said, picking up the phone. Jack nodded, his jaw set. "I'll talk to them again. This sneaky stuff has to stop." The peace was short-lived. After the incident with the unauthorized lunch, Helen and Frank seemed to simmer just below the surface, and you could cut the tension in the house with a knife. I was washing dishes one evening when the calm shattered once again. Jack had just come in from the yard, looking weary. I was about to ask him about his day when the loud crash from the living room had us both running. We found Frank standing over a broken vase, one of the few decorations I really cared about. "What happened here?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice level. "It slipped," Frank said, barely looking regretful. "Accidents happen." But his tone was all wrong. It wasn't apologetic, it was defiant. Jack bent down to pick up the pieces of the broken vase, and I couldn't help but speak up. "That vase was from my grandmother. It's been here longer than I have," I said. Helen scoffed from the doorway. "It's just a vase. You can get another." "That's not the point, Helen," I snapped, feeling my frustration rise. "The point is respect, something that's clearly lacking here." "You want to talk about respect?" Frank shot back, his voice raising. "What about respecting us, treating us like second-class citizens in this house?" Jack stood up, facing his father. You're living here by our goodwill, Dad. Remember that? It doesn't feel like goodwill. Helen chimed in, her words sharp. It feels like we're unwelcome. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope with Frank and Helen in our house. But one evening pushed me past my breaking point. We were sitting around the dinner table, the same place that had witnessed countless arguments, when Helen casually dropped her latest bombshell. Jack, darling, I found this lovely coat today, and I think we should buy it using the college fund you've set up for Liam, she said, as if suggesting we switch brands of coffee. I choked on my water, coughing as I set my glass down hard on the table. What did you just say? My voice was a mix of disbelief and rising anger. Helen smiled sweetly, clearly mistaking my shock for compliance. It's just money, dear. Liam can always take out loans for college. I really need a new coat. Jack, who'd been quietly seething beside me, slammed his fork down. Mom, that's out of the question. That money is for our son's education. We're not using it for anything else. Helen's face twisted into a scowl. How can you deny your own mother a simple request? It's not simple, and that's final, I snapped, feeling the last of my patience evaporate. Frank chimed in, his voice raised to a shout. You're both being unreasonable and cruel. We're your family. The threat came next, his voice cold and calculated. Maybe the local press would be interested to know how you treat your family. What about your bosses, huh? Would they like to know? I felt a mix of fury and fear churn in my stomach, but I knew we couldn't cave. Enough, I shouted back, standing up. This is not how family treats each other. You two need to find another place to live. This isn't working. Helen burst into tears, playing the victim, while Frank continued to hurl accusations and threats. The dinner ended with them storming out of the room, leaving Jack and me in stunned silence. Once the house was quiet, I retreated to the bedroom and dialed my grandmother. She picked up after a few rings, her voice a comforting presence. Grandma, it's Emma, I said, my voice thick with emotion. What's wrong, dear? She asked, her tone immediately alert. I poured out everything, the demands, the threats, the impossible situation with Helen and Frank. My grandmother listened without interrupting, her quiet hums a steady reassurance in the background. When I finished, there was a brief pause, then decisively she said, I'll come to stay with you for a couple of months. Are you sure, Grandma? What about the nursing home? I'm sure. It sounds like you need me there, and I'm not one to sit by when my family is in trouble, she declared, her voice resolute. When Grandma arrived, it was like a gust of fresh air swept through the house. She might have been older and moved a little slower, but her spirit was as fiery as ever. Frank and Helen were visibly put off by her sudden presence, their discomfort clear as day. I'll be staying on the ground floor, Grandma declared firmly the moment she rolled through the door, her suitcase following behind her like a loyal companion. I expect some things will need to be moved. Frank tried to mask his irritation with a forced smile. Of course we'll make you comfortable, won't we, Helen? Helen nodded stiffly, her eyes darting around, probably calculating what they'd need to shift or hide away. I couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. Finally, someone was putting them in their place. As soon as the movers finished rearranging the furniture to make room for Grandma, she called a family meeting in the living room. Now I've heard quite a bit from Emma about what's been going on here, and I'm not pleased, she began, her tone stern, cutting through any pretense of pleasantries. Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Grandma raised her hand, silencing him. I'm not done. This house is still mine, technically, and while I've allowed Emma and Jack to live here without rent, that doesn't extend to you two. The blood drained from Helen's face. You want us to pay rent? She sputtered. Yes, I do. $4,000 a month, Grandma stated flatly. That's outrageous, Frank exclaimed, standing up from his chair. We can't afford that. Well, considering the costs you've been racking up here, I'd say you can afford to cut back on your luxuries, Grandma shot back. But we're family, Helen tried, her voice quivering slightly. Family doesn't exploit each other, Grandma countered. Since you've been enjoying a lifestyle beyond your means on my granddaughter's dime, I think it's only fair. Frank and Helen were at a loss for words, exchanging glances as if looking for an out but finding none. And one more thing, Grandma continued. If you think the rent is too high, you're welcome to find somewhere else to live. Or, if you decide to stay, they'll provide me with daily assistance. The morning after Grandma laid down her new house rules, it was like someone had flipped a switch in Frank and Helen. I walked into the kitchen to find them packing their things, a pile of boxes already forming at the door. We decided to move out, Frank announced, not looking up from the box he was sealing. We found a small apartment. We'll take our things and go. Helen was quieter, busily stuffing things into bags, her movements sharp and quick. It's for the best, she muttered almost to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. The rest of the morning was a blur of activity. Boxes and furniture moved out the door. Jack helped more out of a sense of duty than anything else. By mid-afternoon, their part of the house was eerily empty, the echo of their departure hanging in the air. Once they'd driven off, Grandma, who'd been watching quietly from her chair, gave me a knowing look. Well, that's that, then. They'll be all right, you know. Sometimes a little hardship is needed to bring people back to earth. We found out later that they'd sold most of their belongings to cover the rent and their other debts. The luxurious life they were used to was trimmed down to essentials, much like their new apartment. Grandma stayed with us for 2 more weeks, a comforting presence in the house. Eventually, she decided it was time to return to her nursing home. Driving her back, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Thanks for everything, Grandma. We couldn't have managed without you, I said sincerely. She waved off my thanks with a chuckle. Oh, nonsense. You're stronger than you think. Just remember to stand up for yourselves. No one else will do it for you. I kissed her goodbye, promising to visit soon. When I got home, the house seemed bigger, quieter. That night, we sat on our porch, the evening air cool and pleasant. Life had thrown us a curveball, but we had caught it, dealt with it, and were ready to move on. Whatever came next, we knew we could handle it together, with or without anyone else's approval.